So, welcome everybody to this month's Impactful Leadership Lab. And today I really wanted to talk about a topic that is really front of mind for me today, which is all about reinvention. And some of you might have seen that my word for 2025 is reinvention. And so I thought it would be appropriate for us to run a short webinar and talk about what is reinvention. So I've called this the Reinvention Code, Thriving in a Rapidly Changing World, because I think we can probably all agree that we live in a world that is continually changing. And as a result of that, that's meaning that we need to continually reinvent. So what do we mean by reinvention? Because I've seen some posts actually recently all over Facebook and LinkedIn talking about, there's no need to reinvent, and that reinvention is about throwing away the past and coming up with something new. And that's really not the definition I have of reinvention. For me, reinvention is about leveraging all the great things that we've had going on in the past and finding new ways into the future. And it's a reflection of a mindset shift that I think that we're seeing in the way that we succeed and change. And some of you are probably familiar with the concept of a fixed versus a growth mindset. And yeah, a fixed mindset is I can't do anything different. We've always done everything this way. I'm not open to learning. Whereas a growth mindset is I'm always open to learning and doing something new. And I think that's really what's happening in the world today. We're getting to a point where we really need to look at reinvention, because this is something that is becoming intertwined into everything we do within business. And I also think that reinvention is a really great way to embrace change and reimagine and remake something so that it manifests new and improved attributes and results. And what I particularly like about it is because we look at the past and figure out what we can change going into the future, it's a very systematic approach. And many of you will know that I'm really, really passionate about systems and nature and what we can learn about having a really holistic view to things. So I think it provides us a systematic approach on how to thrive in chaos. And how do we create this continuous learning and development processes to keep our organizations at the forefront of everything that's going on? And not just our organizations, but also ourselves, because I think we can all agree that things are rapidly changing in the world, in the workplace, indeed. We've seen the advent of AI in the last couple of years. And how is that really shifting what people are doing in the workplace? I know from my own perspective, I'm using AI tools a lot more in my business, and it's radically altering the amount of time it takes me to research and curate materials. So there's some personal reinvention going on here and some company reinvention going on here. You might want to think of it a little bit like reinvention is the immune system, and it's really designed to ensure we keep systemic health of both ourselves and our organization. And it really helps when we think about reinvention as being part of the business cycle. It lets us plan in this renewal and renovation of our organizations so that they stay current and viable. So that's really why I wanted to jump into reinvention today, because I think it's just such a key topic for all of us in the business world right now. So some really, really shocking stats that I wanted to share with you. That of the Fortune 500 companies, over the last 66 years, 88% of them have already disappeared. And it is estimated that 50% of the Standard & Poor's 500 companies will be gone in 10 years. So we're seeing the demise of companies that in the old days would have maybe had a lifespan of 75 years, all of a sudden are disappearing off the face of the earth. And many of you will be familiar with some of the corporate exits and tragedies that we've seen in the last few years. Here in the UK, Woolworths, which was a high street kind of store where I went when I was a kid and got all my sweets. Things like Blockbuster Videos, things like Kodak, things like Nokia, companies that were once really, really big high street names have just disappeared. So what does this mean for us? Well, incredibly, 70% of all transformation efforts fail and don't give the results that we had hoped for. So what does this suggest? It suggests to me that we've got something profoundly wrong with our basic assumptions about how change works. And so why is this? Why have we got all of these things not working in the way that we expected? And I think it's because we've got a real mindset shift going on, because in the old days, change rarely happened, right? In the old industrial age, things were pretty much the same. Nobody knew what was going on. We were the days before the internet, and we pretty much all lived in quite little individual silos. We were in our own environments, and we didn't know what was happening in the rest of the world. And fast forward to today, where change is constant and it is happening all of the time. We talk about being in this VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So change is always there. And in fact, the only constant in business now is change. I think we're moving from a mindset of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, to the fact that we need to break things before somebody else does, or somebody else comes up with a new idea or concept that's going to make our own product obsolete. I also think we're seeing a shifting mindset when in the old days, we just had sporadic projects that addressed change. Whereas nowadays, I would really, really encourage you to start building a deliberate system that encourages proactive reinvention within the business. In the past, I think we've used to bet on the new. If we came up with something new, that would be life-changing for our business. But as I said at the beginning, for me, reinvention isn't about just betting on the new. It's about preserving the best of the old while fostering and creating the new. So let's take the best of what we've learned and combine that with what we need in the future. And also, we've often worked in business from a mindset of let's fix the problems we have today. We've been very, very reactive in business. And one thing I'd like to encourage you to do is think about how do we succeed today while building up for tomorrow? So let's just think about how change happens in the organization and why we need reinvention. Well, if we think about a typical business cycle, a business will start in the startup phase, it'll go through growth, it'll get to maturity, and then it naturally declines. All businesses go through this kind of cycle, just like the cycles of nature that we've spoken about on previous webinars. So we just need to know that that is going on and that our business ultimately will go into decline. So if we look at this, we call these S curves, and you can see them here. The business grows, and then at a point, it will start declining. And if we haven't thought about what our next S curve is going to be, that's when the business will falter and not survive. So really what we need to do is almost before we get to that point of maturity, we need to be thinking ahead to what will we have on the next S curve, and then what will we have on the next S curve. So I hope that makes sense to people, how we need to keep growing and developing our business. But this is what has changed, because in the industrial era, the average lifespan of a company was like 75 years. So we would join a company, and the company would pretty much be like that for the duration of our lives. And then what we've seen with the advent of technology and moving much more into the internet and the moving out of the industrial revolution, into a kind of more technology-driven environment, that lifespan, according to the research, was dropping to about 15 years. But this is really, really the shocking thing that I want to share with you, is that now that number is more like about 5 years. So what does that mean for businesses? Well, of course, our biggest challenge is that a 5 to 10 year plan is no longer functional for a business nowadays, because within 5 years, we're going to need to reinvent our businesses. And in fact, the latest data out from the Academy of Reinvention actually shows that 20% of organizations are actually reinventing every year. I say that again, 20% of organizations actually reinventing every year. So our concept of long-term planning really, really doesn't exist, and we need to have a much more agile approach to how we look at reinvention and how we're planning and forecasting, because things aren't going to be consistent over a period of time. So as a leader, this provides some real challenges for us, right? What kinds of skills and capabilities are needed to succeed? What's the safest way to approach your product portfolio? What's the best way to approach financial planning? Maybe what's the optimal level of debt, and how should you budget in an environment that's changing so rapidly? And therefore, how do we need to avoid this natural decline? How do we need to continuously renew, recreate, and reinvent ourselves? So this is why I wanted to pick up this topic of reinvention to share with you today, because I just think it's so, so important to where we are in business right now and what we need to be doing in 2025 to stay competitive in the landscape. So this is what I'd like to share with you today. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about something called what is Titanic syndrome, and I'll be explaining that in a moment. I'm then going to share with you a little bit about the reinvention mindset and share a little bit about a reinvention framework that you can use and put into practice right now within your businesses. And finally, I want to look at overcoming resistance to reinvention and why that happens and what we can do again to mitigate that. So, you ready for a story? Let's just think about what sunk the Titanic. So I'd like you to think back and imagine it's April the 14th, 1912, and it's just before midnight, and the royal steamer Titanic is en route to Southampton, from Southampton to New York. And as we know, it tragically collided with an iceberg and it sank within 3 hours. And it led to the death of nearly 1,500 people of the 2,224 passengers. The interesting thing that a lot of people don't know about the sinking of the Titanic was that the crew had some warning signs that this was about to happen. And they just didn't have one more warning sign. They incredibly had 6 warning signs that there was a good, strong possibility that the Titanic would collide with an iceberg. So I want to share with you what those warning signs are, because we see these warning signs happening in business. And yet again, like the crew on the Titanic, we can ignore them. So the first warning sign actually happened before the ship left Southampton, because the second officer, David Blair, he was meant to be one of the leaders in charge of the ship. And at the last minute, he was pulled from the ship and replaced by somebody else. And what happened in that moment of that last minute change was that Second Officer David Blair forgot to do a handover to the person taking over from him. And he forgot to hand over a set of keys for a number of storerooms that he held on the ship. So nobody bothered to ask for the keys. He forgot to hand them over. And of course, then the ship left sail without these keys. The second warning that they had was this. The two scouts that were out at the top of the lookout deck looking out for icebergs. A lot of people maybe think, oh, perhaps they were asleep, they didn't see the icebergs. But again, that's not the case. Actually, they were new to shift. They were only working in 2-hour stints. And they were up in that crow's nest looking for danger. And what they had up there was a large bell to grab the general attention of people on the ship, should they see any danger, and also a telephone to reach the captain's bridge. However, there's one very, very important piece of equipment that they didn't have, and that was a set of binoculars, so they could see into the future and see what was coming up. And why didn't they have those binoculars? Well, because they were locked in one of the cupboards that the second officer hadn't handed the keys over to when he departed the ship and was no longer sailing on it. And ironically, they probably could have broken down the door to get into where the binoculars were, but nobody even thought to do that. So the third warning sign that there could be a problem coming ahead was the fact that no safety drills were ever organized before or during the voyage. So nobody was effectively in charge of passenger safety. And it's a really ironic twist of fate that the first lifeboat drill for passengers and crew was actually scheduled at 11 a.m. on the day the ship sank. However, for some reason that we don't know, the captain cancelled it with no explanation. So what was the challenge of that? It was that the crew didn't know how to act in a disaster. They didn't know what to do. The passengers didn't know what to do. The fourth warning sign was because everyone was so confident that the ship wouldn't sink. There were insufficient life rafts on board for all of the passengers. And of course, what we know that did happen is when the ship did crash and was sinking, the staff probably also didn't realize there were insufficient life rafts. And so they were putting people on life rafts and setting them off onto the seas when they weren't at full capacity. Well, given that they were insufficient, they definitely needed to be at full capacity to even have some chance of getting the majority of people off the boat. The fifth warning sign for the ship was that they had a radio room. And you've got to imagine here, there was a lot of very, very wealthy people on the Titanic. And the crew were really, really anxious to provide amazing customer service for the very, very wealthy clients on board the ship. So there was a lot of telecommunications going on between the ship and its destination in New York to make sure that all the things that the guests wanted were available at the destination. So a lot of radio traffic going on throughout from the ship. And this actually caused a problem because there was a very, very specific message that was sent to the ship advising them that there were icebergs ahead. But because it wasn't marked with the preface MSG, Master Service Ground, which meant it needed to be given immediately to the ship's captain, it was interpreted as not urgent. And the people in the radio room just went to sending messages back to New York to sort out customers' requirements. So the ship actually had some warning signs and got some messages that there were icebergs up ahead, but nobody passed them on because they were too fixated on this customer service at that moment that they didn't see the bigger picture of what was going on. And then lastly, when it was actually seen that there was an iceberg coming ahead, it wasn't actually the captain that was in charge of the ship at that moment. It was the first officer, William McMaster Murdoch. And he was a very, very experienced captain. He'd had 16 years of maritime experience, and he was really known for his cool head and quick thinking. And in fact, just a few months before, his quick thinking had averted a ship's collision. So William McMaster Murdoch, he relied on his expertise and what had worked previously to get the ship out of having a collision. And unfortunately, a lot of the research seems to indicate that what he did was he turned the bow of the boat towards the iceberg, and the ship hit the iceberg side on. A lot of the research seems to actually indicate that actually the ship probably wouldn't have sunk if it had hit the iceberg straight on, straight from the front of the boat. So there was something about his level of expertise and what had worked in the past didn't actually work in this particular situation. So let me just summarize those for you. What were the 6 reasons that caused the Titanic to sink? No handover. Well, how often do we see this in business when there isn't a handover? And somebody goes into a role and doesn't get to know all the facts about it. The second reason was the insufficient equipment, the wrong equipment. The people up in the crow's nest had no binoculars to be able to see what they had to do. So they didn't have the right resources for the job. There was no practice. We hadn't tried and perfected what was going on. Nobody knew the drill. As well, in terms of the lifeboats, again, insufficient resources. We had been too complacent about the fact that the ship would never go down, that we hadn't purchased enough lifeboats for the job. Number 5, focusing on the wrong things. Those radio operators were focusing on the wrong things. They didn't notice those notifications to advise of the icebergs up ahead. And finally, relying on past success, thinking that what happened in the past is going to work for us today. So those 6 reasons I think are really, really applicable for us in business today, because how often do we see that happening? No handover, insufficient resources, focusing on the wrong thing, not training and developing our people well enough, or relying on what's worked in the past for that to be a precursor of what's going to happen in the future. So my invitation to you right now is to think about, well, what are the icebergs in your business that could potentially take it down? I've actually just been on a call earlier on today, and I was talking with one of my coaches, and we were talking a lot about the whole area of leadership development and training. Because the challenge for people delivering courses right now is that ChatGPT can deliver some amazing structures and formats for courses. And so maybe some of the online training that people have purchased in the past may no longer have a longevity going forward. But the one thing I'm really, really excited about is what can't be replicated by technology are the human-to-human connections and the experiences I curate with the horses. You know, ChatGPT and other IA platforms can't take that over. People are always going to require that. So as I move forward with my business, I really need to think about what are those differentiators and where do I need to put my time and energy to ensure I have a viable business going forward. So what is Titanic syndrome? Well, it's actually become a recognized challenge and problem for organizations. And it's defined as a corporate disease in which organizations facing disruption bring about their own downfall through arrogance, excessive attachment to past success, or inability to recognize the new and emerging reality. And I'd really like you to think about that, because I'm seeing so many organizations. And if we look at some of those companies that haven't survived, like Kodak, like Blockbuster, like Nokia, what were some of those things that caused them not to survive? They were, being reliant on, that Nokia phone. It had been so successful in the past. Why would anyone want to change? It was about really not being a little bit arrogant about what was needed and thinking that they were going to be invincible in the marketplace. The same with Kodak, really not responding to digital film and really thinking that people would want to continue to use the old-fashioned film. And, again, also not realizing that, people's requirement for cameras per se would change a lot as cameras got built into phones. So these are all reasons why some of those companies saw a demise. So I really love this quote from Peter Drucker, which is: the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, but to act with yesterday's logic. And I really want you to, again, reflect on that statement, because it's very, very easy for us to think about, well, this worked in the past. We've all been in situations where, this is what works. We need to keep doing this because this is what works. But what I'd like to invite you to open your eyes up to is the fact that because we're living in a time of such great turbulence, what worked in the past isn't necessarily going to work going forward. So with that, I just want to share with you a reinvention mindset and some tools that you can use to help you. So the reinvention mindset is three things: curiosity, adaptability, and courage. So with curiosity, we're constantly asking, what if? So curiosity is the antidote to complacency. And leaders who ask themselves, what if, keep themselves and their teams open to new ideas, new possibilities, and approaches. It means they're always looking ahead and scanning for changes and exploring opportunities to reinvent. Because as we've seen, Titanic syndrome thrives on certainty, the fact that they thought they were unsinkable and nothing would change. Whereas curious leaders are disrupting the certainty by questioning those assumptions. What if we're wrong? What if there's a better way? Adaptability. This is all about embracing ambiguity and change as opportunities, not threats. So adaptability is the ability to adjust course quickly and effectively in response to new information or circumstances. And leaders with an adaptable mindset view change not as a threat to stability, but as a gateway to growth and innovation. So why does this matter? Well, the Titanic's fate was sealed because its crew couldn't adapt to the changing circumstances quickly enough. And they dismissed the iceberg threat until it was too late. So leaders who embrace adaptability, they stay agile. They respond to shifts in the market, team dynamics, and a broader environment with creativity and speed. And finally, the last reinvention mindset I'd like to share with you is have courage. Courage to let go of what no longer serves your vision. Because courage is all about making bold decisions to release outdated practices that no longer serve us, or beliefs or structures. And we need to do this even when it feels uncomfortable. So it's about having that strength to move forward into uncharted territories. And this is important because Titanic syndrome thrives on attachment to the status quo. We've always done it this way. But courageous leaders recognize that clinging to the past only delays the inevitable. They let go of what no longer serves the future they're trying to create. And when we're thinking about this, I really want you to think about, how do we let go of things? Because that's really, really important. We're going to come to that in a moment. But to survive and thrive in a risky, interconnected world of constant flux, you must make reinvention part of your daily life. You must continually need to have this curiosity, adaptability, and courage. Now, I think what it is important to say when we're talking about reinvention is that there are things that you can control, things that you can influence, and things over which you have no control or influence. You want to be reinventing the things that you have under your ability to control, and potentially the things you're able to influence. There's no point in wasting your time and energy on things you can't control or influence. You know, we're not going to be able to reinvent some of the things that the government does. But can you reinvent something within your own organization? Something you've got control over? Absolutely. And we can all reinvent our thoughts and our beliefs. We can all reinvent how we think about reinvention. Is it something we want to embrace or something that we want to resist? So really think about that when you're thinking about reinvention. What are the things that you can control? And we want to put our efforts of reinvention there rather than on things we can't control or influence. So I'm now going to share with you the 4R practical framework to reinvention. So step 1, I'd like you to reflect and understand where you are, because the first step of reinvention is self-awareness. So we've got to pause, we've got to look back and honestly assess what is going on right now, what's working, what's not, and what needs to change. Because without this reflection and awareness, we risk repeating patterns that no longer serve us. And a great tool that I love to share with people is this, the start-stop continuum timeline, really, because we really need to think about what do we need to start? What are new habits that we need to foster to move things forward? But if we're going to bring new things into our life, into our business, we have to realize our business has a finite amount of energy. So it's equally important to look at, what do we need to stop doing? What are the old patterns that block change? What do we need to stop doing because it's no longer effective? Because only when we stop doing things do we allow the space for us to start new things. And finally, what do we need to continue doing? What things need to be amplified that we have already going on in the business? So that's a really, really good lens to look at when we're becoming self-aware about what do we need to start, stop, and continue. So the first part of the 4R framework is reflect. The second part is reimagine. What do you want to visualize that's possible beyond the status quo? You need to dream boldly at this point. This reimagine is about curiosity, creativity, and visualizing new possibilities. It requires stepping out of what is and asking what could be. What if we had no constraints, time, money, and resources? What if we started afresh today? How would we design things differently? What if we embraced a completely different way of thinking? It also means we can look outside of our industry and see what's happened in other industries and what we can learn from that and how we can adapt those lessons to our own context. And we also might want to reconnect with our purpose and reimagine how we can serve our mission in new, bold ways. What impact do we want to have in the next 3 to 5 years, and what can we do differently? The third R is all about recalibration. So this is about taking aligned action. So recalibration is where reflection and imagination meet. This is where we identify the concrete steps to move forward towards our new vision. It focuses on agility, starting small, testing ideas, and adjusting as you learn. So some key actions for you to be able to recalibrate are really thinking about 2 to 3 priorities that align with your vision. Break down these big goals into smaller actionable steps, and then experiment and learn, try things out, get ideas, gather feedback, and then make adjustments. And also build accountability to make sure everything happens whilst we celebrate the wins. And finally, the fourth R is all about repeat. So we've talked about earlier on, reinvention is a continuous cycle. It's not a one and done exercise. It's an ongoing mindset. And the world's constantly changing, and leaders must continually revisit what is going on in this cycle. So, we need to reflect, reimagine, recalibrate, repeat. Reflect, reimagine, recalibrate, repeat. Reflect, reimagine, recalibrate, repeat. So you might want to schedule maybe quarterly or biannual reflection sessions, and always be thinking about what's next. How can we improve? Now, we know that when we need to change, we saw early on 75% of change projects fail to work, is because we need to overcome some resistance. And these are common barriers to stopping us moving forward and adopting a reinvention mindset. And the first of those is fear of failure. What happens if it doesn't work? Well, this is why we need to have this iterative process of the 4 R's. We need to try something and experiment, get feedback, and if it doesn't work, we need to try something else. We live in such a dynamic world that even something that worked last week isn't necessarily going to work this week. So we're saying that we've got a fear of failure, but actually we never know when something that's already in existence is going to fail. Another reason that we often have some barriers to reinvention is this organizational inertia. It's too much hard work. Why do we want to do it? But we've seen the statistics are compelling. Companies that don't reinvent, on average now, sort of every 5 years, are going to become obsolete. So, if we think about some of those companies that haven't survived, like Nokia, like Blockbuster, a lot of that came from organizational inertia. I mean, both of those companies were aware of the new trends coming into their marketplace. My understanding is Kodak, were already experimenting with digital film. And certainly Nokia had put quite a lot of money into research and development and had their own version of a smartphone. They just never thought people would go with it. So this organizational inertia, and perhaps combined with a fear of failure, stopped them moving forward. And finally, the other barrier to reinvention is skepticism from team members. Why do we think that's going to work? So we really need to start helping organizations foster a culture of collaboration where everyone feels that they're part of that change process. And hopefully that would mitigate some of the skepticism. Because when we think about Titanic syndrome that we were talking about earlier on, leaders who avoid Titanic syndrome recognize that resistance is natural, but it must be navigated with empathy, clarity, and persistence. So reinvention is a journey, not a destination. And when leaders continually reflect, reimagine, recalibrate, and repeat, they steer their teams away from the icebergs of stagnation and chart a course towards a bold, impactful future. So I just want to leave you with this thought. A few years ago, we really thought the best skill that we needed to teach our children in school was programming. I'd like to suggest that the best skill that we can teach our children is reinvention. And as business leaders and as parents and stewards of the world, I really think we need to embrace this whole concept of reinvention and share it with others, because it is the only way that we're going to continue to thrive. So, thank you so much for your time today and letting me share a little bit about reinvention with you and why it's so important. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn at Julia Felton on LinkedIn. I have a podcast called Impactful Teamwork, where we're often discussing issues affecting business, particularly as it relates to the people in your team. And if you're just curious to learn more about reinvention, I'd really invite you to hop on a call with me and let's just brainstorm some ideas. How can we do some reinvention either for you personally or within your business? And you can always book an appointment with me at calendly.com/Julia Felton/discovery. And I love to speak to people and share with you ideas, and I'll give you loads of really practical steps that you can take to move forward. So I'd love to just thank you for your time. And at this point, I'm just going to stop the recording and I'm going to come into the room and find out and take questions from people. So thank you so much, and I shall speak to you shortly.